This is Product of Newfoundland, a podcast about the strange truths and tall tales of a foggy island, Newfoundland, Canada. I'm Robert, and today I'm interested in the story of a miraculous iceberg, a poetic bishop, and a photoshopped postcard. On Sunday, June 24th, 1905, the Most Reverend Michael Francis Howley, the newly proclaimed Archbishop of Newfoundland, stepped out of the basilica and looked towards St. John's harbour. Just outside the Narrows, he saw an enormous iceberg, and depending on who you ask, something supernatural. Icebergs were, and are, a pretty common sight in St. John's, but this one was a little different. One end of the berg had a really high peak, while the other had an almost human-shaped pillar of ice. Howley thought this wasn't just any human statue. It was, he believed, the Virgin Mary rendered in ice. He thought the iceberg was a divine sign, a blessing on the city and island. It wasn't long before the berg was causing a commotion among the people of St. John's, many of whom made their way to see it. Among them was Thomas B. Hayward, an artist and photographer. He snapped a picture of the berg. The image survives to this day. It's pretty grainy, but it's easy to see what Howley was talking about. It's pretty easy to imagine it's a person. If you want to see it for yourself, check out the blog post linked in the podcast description. That said, I'm not ready to say the iceberg was any kind of miracle. The overwhelmingly Christian population of St. John's may have been primed to interpret a human-shaped ice pillar as a message from heaven. There was a lot of stuff going on in the city at the time. As the story gets told, the iceberg appeared on the feast day of St. John the Baptist, the man for whom the city was named. On top of that, it was the anniversary of John Cabot's supposed arrival in Newfoundland. At the same time, the iceberg-spotting Archbishop Howley had just been invested as the first archbishop of the newly created ecclesiastical province of Newfoundland. On the day prior to the berg's arrival, he was conferred the pallium, a symbolic ecclesiastical vestment. The presentation of the pallium not only spoke of Howley's importance in the Catholic Church, but recognized Newfoundland itself within the organization. If you were the kind of person for whom the church mattered, and in 1905 many Newfoundlanders were in that camp, it was a big deal. You need only look at the newspapers of the time. Howley and the pallium received extensive coverage. So with religious talk very much in vogue, it would have been easy to interpret an ill-defined human shape as having divine significance. More than that, interpreting the image as a blessing was probably comforting, especially as the Catholic Church was evolving on the island. Archbishop Howley certainly seemed hung up on the idea, and favored the interpretation of the berg as a form of divine celebration, of the island, of the church, and possibly himself. He penned a sonnet titled Our Lady of Fjords, which appeared in the 1909 edition of the Newfoundland Quarterly that recounted the iceberg. He called it a shimmering shine, a bright Atlantic Lords. He linked it to John the Baptist, Cabot, and the pallium. Aside from his poem, he wrote a piece for a church publication in Boston about the berg, and authorized the sale of postcards featuring Hayward's iceberg image. In fact, it's probably owing to his interest in the Virgin Berg that it's remembered at all today. In trying to learn more about the story of Newfoundland's miraculous iceberg, I read as many newspapers from the time as I could. There was, as I mentioned already, lots of writing about Howley and the pallium, but no reference to any sort of noteworthy iceberg on or in the days immediately around June 24th, 1905, none that I can find anyway. And the press wrote of icebergs a lot at the time. It was sort of as a warning to mariners. It made me wonder, did it happen as we've been told? If you poke around the internet long enough, you can find insinuations that it was all a hoax. I think the doubt mostly lies in the fact that some version of Hayward's supposed photographs appear to be paintings, or they were so heavily retouched that they might as well have been paintings. I don't have any trouble believing Hayward took a picture of Our Lady of the Fjords, or that the Archbishop believed that an iceberg was a divine apparition. I think the iceberg existed because newspapers at the time said it did, sort of. But the reference I found, it wasn't in June. I broadened my search to include dates further from the 24th. The first mention I can find of any similar-sounding iceberg was a week and a half later, on July 4th, 1905. The Evening Telegram out of St. John's reported a pretty iceberg that was outside the Narrows with a human figure statue on one end. I think that's gotta be the Our Lady of Fjords. It's not very likely that 2 statue bergs would arrive in a 10-day span. That said, I wonder if an iceberg that appeared as a frozen, icy statue on June 24th would still look like one 10 days later and be notable in the newspaper. It's possible, I guess, but I'm doubtful. I'm thinking an unusual iceberg from early July got remembered as happening alongside some historic, noteworthy dates in late June because, well, people wanted there to be a connection. It's human nature to try and make meaning. And the attempt to keep it together does make for a good story. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not a hoax. An iceberg with a human-shaped pillar of ice arrived in St. John's somewhere between June 24th and July 4th, 1905. It became something to remember, owing to the efforts of a poetic archbishop who, through his words and encouragement of the sale of postcard images, helped people cast it as a blessing on the events on or around June 24th, 1905. So some details were fudged, but the basic story is true. Nearly 120 years ago, an iceberg arrived in St. John's, Newfoundland, that many thought looked like the Virgin Mary. Whether you think it was a sign from God, well, that's between you and your faith. Thanks for listening. If this kind of stuff is up your alley, click subscribe and visit productofnewfoundland.ca for more strange truths and tall tales from Newfoundland, including my recent post, Salads, Saints, and 7 other iceberg oddities, in which I talk about ancient seafaring saints and strange bones spotted in an iceberg. I don't know, man. Tons of crazy stuff has happened on this island.